Here, thank you for joining me today, and I'm really excited to learn more about you and Project X. Let's start at the highest level possible. What is Project X?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Project X is a hypothesis that came out of an experience I had as a member of a task force with our provincial government here in British Columbia. And what we did is we looked at the emerging economy and had a kind of high level and low level scan of what's going on and how we can address the emerging economy. Certainly, at the time we did it, the creative um, space was taking off. Marketplaces were huge. A lot of unanswered questions, especially around marketplaces as they entered the Canadian market.
Mhm.
How to deal with that from a policy and really through that experience and having time to kind of digest all the data and think about it, kind of in unison or in tandem, what I realized was that we really have to be a bit more aware of how venture capital affects the emerging economy and how applied research and applied researchers affect the emerging economy. And those are really the two kind of big unanswered questions I took away and started answering on my own after the task force, which turned out to be the hypothesis that's now called Project X.
And
Um,
Peter, just to make sure I'm on the right page, like what exactly is an emerging economy in this definition? How should I think about that?
Yeah, and that's a good question because there's a lot of ways of looking at that, and I think really in the context of what I'm thinking about is how do we leverage this transition of both innovation and wealth to better serve society as a whole. We're really coming to that that inflection point where it's harder and harder to ignore or avoid planet and human suffering. So really, how do we take advantage of the emerging economy? The other context would be something like the explosion of marketplaces like Airbnb and Uber,
Yeah.
that are incredibly disruptive to public policy for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
the one that really caught my attention was the taxi industry. Until somebody explained to me why the value of taxi licenses would disappear overnight, I didn't really understand the cause and effect. And same as from a tax point of view, lodging in hotels versus people just renting out their space. So there's no right answer. There's good and bad cause and effect, but I think it was just really about how do we prepare for the emerging economy. And I just took that one step further and said, well, not only how do we prepare, but actually how do we take advantage of it? And
Okay, super helpful. So like the first thing that came to mind for me was an emerging market like, bricks or something like they used to call them. So you're more saying like a new age economy, marketplaces, those dynamics that just change how business is done.
yeah, and I think you have to look at it as systemic change, like not incremental,
Yeah.
small, slow change, but actually these things that disrupt the entire ecosystem.
Cool. Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful framework. So what is the hypothesis of Project X?
Yeah, so the hypothesis really, the inquiry was two questions. One, if we believe there's a clock ticking on climate mitigation and or adaptation, venture capital isn't going to respond quick enough to bring forward good ideas and innovation into the marketplace that are investable. Therefore, being able to solve some of those problems.
And that because of their time horizon, because of their LPs, like why aren't they suited to do that?
Yeah, so one, their thesis, so their investment thesis, isn't flexible. When people become LPs, they're becoming LPs of a fixed um, investment thesis, and the other one, the time horizons, and the fact that venture capital, it's really there to accelerate high growth and rapid growth, it's not there to support innovation and applied research before it's at revenue or before it's being commercialized. And again, that's a bit of a misunderstanding in the ecosystem. A lot of people feel that that money's available to them when it's really about sales growth is what venture capital is ultimately trying to stimulate. So one of the inquiries was around the financing of applied research to accelerate commercialization, especially when it can actually look at and solve for the inequalities that are either holding back society or holding back the preservation of the planet. And then the other part of that led out of that. So first it was like, okay, venture capital isn't the right mechanism to accelerate good applied research if we care about the time frame. But then from that, I realized, wow, we have a lot of applied researchers that really are being pushed into two categories, either to sell their intellectual property early on or to become entrepreneurial founders. And I thought that seemed like, I'll use the term oxymoron, because why would we take people that have dedicated their lives to a very specific space and are willing to do the research to suddenly say, we think you should be an entrepreneur? And that, to me, that just seemed like a very strange concept. And I asked myself, well, what does that mean? And I started asking applied researchers and suggesting if there was a third option, and what would you think? And they just absolutely lit up every time. And then I started to kind of poke around the incubators, accelerators, and venture studios, looking for the non-entrepreneurial founder, and realized the same thing, that category, we have two things: serial founders and first-time founders. Most first-time founders really don't function well when they're handed a homework assignment to go make a pitch deck without a lot of hand holding. And I thought, again, this model isn't really kind of moving the needle, I guess is the way to put it. So
Yeah.
those are the two inquiries.
Yeah, applied research and being a founder, very different skills. Some
Yeah.
people have the same thing, but it's definitely not a one-for-one correlation there.
And that's where, when you start asking yourself that question, where it gets really interesting, because you realize, and I know there's a lot of support around, you can teach entrepreneurship and such, but anybody that's worked in this space, they can identify, just like we can identify a future Olympic athlete or a hockey player that's going to go to the NHL. You can actually tell the difference between somebody that's going to be a serial entrepreneur and somebody that's either going to do something one-off and leave the space, or somebody that just is never ever going to take their great idea, and usually they are great ideas, as a product owner, and actually move it forward as an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So I think that is interesting, because we really only have two solutions currently to incubate and accelerate good ideas: either sell it or force yourself into being something that you're really not designed for.
Yeah.
And again, back to the timing, even if you could teach it, we really need to move a lot faster than we are today.
So I suspect we'll spend most of our time on that third way, which is Project X, but maybe it's just a roundabout way to talk about you. Like, why are you the person to think about this and solve this? What led you to this place today?
Yeah, as most people in my position, we don't have a linear career path.
Yeah.
I actually started out as a paramedic in the downtown east side, which is one of the poorest postal codes in North America. I started when I was 19. I was given way more accountability and responsibility than a 19-year-old should be given. And a friend of mine's dad actually pointed out to me one day, when I was telling him about the kind of stuff dealing with, developing years working in that working in that situation in a very high stress environment as as the first responder to those crises. And at the same time, there was a human rights um, ruling that actually started closing a lot of the institutions. So we saw the effect of hundreds of people being deinstitutionalized and moved into these um, low income postal codes, and just the effect of that. So that was really kind of formed a lot of my skills of observation. And then I ended up again, going from 0 to 100. I ended up actually working for Kaufman in the U.S., developing, implementing, and training globally around incident management, while at the same time working with a continuous improvement team that was retooling factories. So I say that that's where I got my real time MBA, was traveling and working with exceptional consultants and ex vice presidents of Fortune 2000 companies that had gone into consulting. And I came back and started my own company, which was always something I wanted to do, and I knew I didn't want to be a paramedic as a career. And I started a medical device company, and we have a couple patents, and I was distributing equipment. So I really learned how to start and scale a business, and bootstrapped. I had earned quite a bit of money to start, and and ended up doing all the learned every mistake, did everything, learned every mistake while I had the opportunity to do that before it was costly. And sold that, and then started really looking at the ecosystem, and what I wanted to do next. And I volunteered in two spaces that actually really joined together my thinking and my thesis. One was in something called local living economies, or community economic development, which is different than traditional economic development. It's about building from the ground up as opposed to attract and retain. And Bali's the U.S. organization that it's got a new name now, but that was kind of the one of the drivers, and it was really about community leadership. And then the other one is I got into venture angel investing, because I realized that we had an incredibly strong academic and community support systems, but we didn't have anybody really curating the investment. And in those days, this was pre when banks didn't know what to do with venture, and before debt financing, and this was what, 10 years ago now. So I got to really dive into that, and got to see what it would take to build an angel investment community within a community, thinking about the local living economy. And one of my conclusions was that it actually wasn't going to move the needle. Like they were good, they were nice, things were happening, but it just wasn't enough to to do the kind of good I was looking for. So when I got asked to be on this task force because of my involvement with early stage investing, that's when I really started to realize there was actually better ways of doing things. So that's how I got here. And and I think being somebody with that kind of odd experience is actually what's helping me to really see where the opportunities are, and where as Wayne Gretzky says, where the puck's going, not where it's coming from.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing. I have a really good friend who kind of described philanthropy's role for me by a gap that exists, right? Government can't do it, private business can't do it, individuals can't do it, and there's a little niche that philanthropy supposedly can fill. Is that the right way to think of Project X2? That there's a gap in the market, that there needs to be a third or fourth or fifth solution? And if so, again, now fill us in on what that solution might be that doesn't exist today.
Yeah, and it's interesting you use philanthropy as the analogy, because there is some interesting cultural components of that we've actually plugged into this thesis to drive the hypothesis. And I think what you know, what I keep coming back on is if you take that community minded philanthropic culture, um, and apply that to a business model and a financial revenue model, you should come out with something pretty interesting. And then if you take that one step further and open source it, then it, you're going to see it grow rapidly once people have time to think about the idea in their own context. And so, you know, private investors and government can and have done an incredible job of designing incubators and accelerators for individuals that self-identify as entrepreneurs. So if you're an entrepreneur, the public relations you can get out of government funded incubators and the connections you can get out of private accelerators, and of course, Y Combinator's, always going to be the one that people are going to cite. They do an exceptional job. And so where you have to ask yourself, or where the inquiry is what happens to all the engineers? And actually, Y Combinator wrote a great article on this years ago. What happens to all the engineers that have great ideas that just aren't interested in being founders and entrepreneurs? Where do they go? That's the question I think everyone needs to ask right now that's involved in venture studios, accelerators, and incubators.
Yeah.
Because, where's the Y Combinator for the non-entrepreneur?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And where's the government support for the non-entrepreneur? And what does that look like? And I think venture studios are really interesting. We call them venture builders because we believe you can actually have a 100% wraparound service around a non-entrepreneurial innovator. So that I think is interesting. And then the other one is around venture capital, that who can actually invest in venture capital? What does an institutional investor look like? And then what you start to realize, and again, what the inquiry is how can we deploy our own financial resources in a fairly de-risked way in our own local communities and in innovation, both from looking for a higher internal rate of return or yield, but also just to do more from our investments. So when I started thinking about impact investing and social entrepreneurship, I thought, those are actually distractions. They're okay ideas, but they're not great ideas. And so I would argue, the reason ESGs are popular is because, we're not training our business leaders in a way to think philanthropically, think about the community, think about the greater good. So if we change the culture, we wouldn't need these things. And same as impact investing. Like, I realized there's something out of Stanford. It's called the Stanford Search Fund. And I thought, gee, you could just use a search fund model to buy companies that don't fit your values, and then put in leaders that that can move those companies forward based on those values, which are obviously going to be environmental and socially driven. So I think there's some interesting kind of things to think about that. And for me, what really caught my attention was how do we drive consumer retail investors into this space, especially after or during the pandemic, realizing, how much those local living economies actually matter, and that we're really not stewarded them well. We're not nurturing them. They're not politically aligned because they're long-term, not short-term. And they're just hard work. That was really my conclusion, is why are these things happening the way they are? Because they're easy. These are the path of least resistance. So everything I'm suggesting does require more effort and more mindfulness. So that was kind of really what I started inquiring about, was what would it take for retail investment to land in this space long term, once they're up and running, and then what can we do to really get at those challenges.
Super interesting. So I think we spoke about this before we hit record, I think, but the notion of coming at a new, better question, I think, is something that we're both like enthusiastic about. And it just really struck me that I'd never was a blind spot. That what do you do with very smart people who have really good ideas but can't pursue it or don't want to pursue it, at least in like the founder sense? And it's just like it's a beautiful question. So is that the question you're trying to answer, or is it like a peripheral question that ties to something bigger?
No, I think that is actually the core question for
Yeah.
me, because I see it all day long, and I've seen it my entire life, and there's a term, founderitis, and anybody that's been exposed to the startup ecosystem, has experienced somebody with founderitis, and whether they're investing their families nest egg into a bad idea because they're for whatever reason, or they just don't have the acumen, and not everybody has the resources or the time to go to business school, fundamentals of business, let alone think about the entrepreneurial mindset, which I think is actually should be taught in the social sciences, not in the business sciences. Like, to me, entrepreneurship is actually an art form with a medium, and hopefully that medium's the community, not the individual. And if you think about it in that context, suddenly it changes your perception away from just being a capitalist and making money, but actually using entrepreneurship to change public policy and align a square peg in a square hole in
Yeah.
things that don't make sense to us. And I think the reality is, because we've never given space for those incredibly smart people that have incredibly beautiful ideas, um, they go to an entrepreneurial incubator, accelerator, or venture studio, and they either self-select out or fail out because they're just not the risk that that took them out of the leadership position, but kept them in the group, and built around that. I think we'd see a lot happier people, a lot better results, and an improved society because of it.
Hmm.
So it
So
is
yeah,
interesting how we can get stuck on this kind of one idea of, and again, entrepreneurship is, it makes universities a whack of money.
yeah.
I think it is the most in demand program in most universities now, and it is a rock star, movement, right? Everybody would love to be a successful entrepreneur that wants to be famous, right?
Yeah. So you have me at the question. I'm super intrigued. And then the manifestation of that question is how retail investors can participate, or like what else like leads into that question?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to a lot of my data comes out of the philanthropic space. So one of the things that really caught my attention when I looked at social entrepreneurship and impact investment is, right away I realized that foundations, whether they're family or community, or academic university foundations, they were all using the same investment metrics and model as retail investors. They hire a wealth manager to have a diverse, values-driven portfolio to get the highest yield, and then that yield is dispersed through grants every year. And I thought, oh, so I know some are starting to experiment with their investment portfolio being around impact, but I thought, what about actually creating a vehicle that doesn't require lobbying or cultural change, but just allows for these foundations to invest in their local living economies, as well as taking that one step further, and non-accredited retail investors being able to invest in their local living economies. So some of that thinking comes out of that philanthropic space. And really what that led me to believe was that a lot of the culture around securities regulations is this ability to manage risk. So a lot of the criteria is around personal net worth, for retail investors, to keep them out of venture because it's high risk. And some trends that I think are actually really valuable is one of the ones right now that's gaining popularity is, if it's a space that you're an expert in, you're allowed to be an accredited investor. So a software engineer can invest in software even if they're not accredited. I think that's really important. Uh,
Okay.
That brings in another group into it. But I think we have to take it one step further. And the way I've thought about it, again, is a hypothesis that now needs to be challenged and thought, more deeply about, and bring some rigor to it, is this idea of, can we create a holding company that's publicly traded that houses this innovation? So what you're doing is you're actually giving public shares to the innovator on day one, so there's no need for an exit. Two, you're offering this to institutional and retail investors as a managed portfolio of innovation. And this is already done in private equity, especially around buying, platforms of companies. There's lots of great examples of that, where they pick like say food, and they buy a bunch of food manufacturers and put it
Yeah.
into a portfolio and then trade it publicly. So I'm saying, can we do that with innovation? And I think the way we do that is either to have some sort of stimulus capital that could come from the public investment or from the philanthropic investment to actually be matched with the consumer investment. Because what you need is, you need some time or runway to actually get some of that commercialized and revenue generating, so that money is now being dispersed to the investors, but also self-funding the operation. And I think that has to be a system within a system, as opposed to systems interacting with each other. So it's often suggested to me, go find a wicked problem to solve, go find the research, go find the investment. And it's like, well, that's actually the current model. You're just using different terminology. What I'm saying is, we actually have to come up with a third solution that really is private equity holding company that's publicly traded, ideally, that's now funding the venture builder that's actually producing the companies in the holding company that is creating the yield and improving society, ideally. And again, some of that yield can be thought differently. Like, one of the things from a philanthropic point of view is I believe this concept that we're starting to talk about and see more and more, unrestricted grants. Like that would be something that X, when you think about just general research, how do you help move some of that forward?
Yeah. So
just a different
the
way.
two, we start on the entrepreneur is the wrong word here, but the person with a good idea, right?
We'll call them the founder.
Okay. So I'm this founder. I don't have an inclination to start a company, or I can't, or whatever. In this model, I come here and I sell it to someone, kind of like the search model that you were talking about, or like how does it change my behavior as a person with the idea?
Yeah, so we can kind of get into that technical path. And so really what, again, these sound like tangents, but it's all important to the model. So if you think about the entrepreneurial ecosystem today, accelerators, incubators, public funding, private funding, one of the things that I think would really benefit any country in the world is a higher level of data knowledge. So data-driven decisions, intellectual property strategy, environmental technology mapping. So, a colleague of mine works for Acton out of Germany, which is a venture capital firm, and he's the venture partner in North America. And so he has a global perspective on software as a service, like a specialty. And he said one thing he's realized talking to entrepreneurs in North America, whether it's Boston, New York, San Francisco, Vancouver, Toronto, he said, they don't realize that there's somebody working on the same problem in another country. And because he has more data, he knows that. And so when he's making his report on what to invest in, he can include that global environmental scan. And that was kind of the kernel of the idea that caught my attention, to say, how do we bring that forward that's more accessible? So when I think about, how we're supporting the ecosystem, that's a really good example, is just having really good data. And I know there's a lot of conversation right now around the difference between IP, transfer IP, intellectual property, and intellectual property strategy. And Nest is actually the best example. Is, they really came at it from a strategic point of view and sold a patent portfolio as opposed to a piece of internet um, hardware. And I think this stuff is a more sophisticated way of looking at it that's actually really important. So if somebody had an idea, they would come to an organization like Project X as a commercialization as a service model to offer, but they'd have to go through that due diligence, and that would be very high level due diligence. And the other piece that makes this interesting is most startups, even venture backed early on startups, can't afford the best talent. So by approaching it from a fractional point of view, you could actually employ the best talent, whether it's ad hoc or traditionally, to provide that level of knowledge early on. And so, I call it kind of red light, green light. So, that's the first red light, that if this isn't an idea worth pursuing, whatever that thesis is, it could just be monetary or it could be other metrics. You would just stop right there because you'd have the data to back up the decision. And I see that all the time in incubators and accelerators, that people are being mentored, coached, advised on an idea that the advisors and mentors really have no skin in the game. And they're promoting an idea of somebody that has incredible talent that could be used elsewhere. And you see that a lot in the SaaS world. Is, there's so much engineering talent that's just kind of dormant, working on SaaS companies, when really they could be solving big problems. And
Hmm.
I'm always kind of interested in that. Yeah, so getting that level of data is really important. And then the other thing is just kind of looking at the canvas, and instead of forcing that founder to do it themselves and learn how to be an entrepreneur, do it for them. Like, bring in the best marketing minds, bring in the best sales minds, and map it out. Like, create, whether it's value stream mapping to start with, or just canvas, or whatever model you want to use, but really map that out for them. So you have a critical path and a way of using value stream mapping to accelerate that critical path, and even to the point where you're actually testing customers before it's even got out of somebody's just out of their thought process. And I don't know why we're not doing that. Like, I find that really interesting, that people can spend an enormous amount of time, especially in universities applied research, working on ideas that and again, research is different. Like, I always want to preface applied research, like a research that is supposed to be, that's been given grant money because it's supposed to have a commercial application. So general research, by all means, that can go on all day long. But yeah, so I was amazed that there's a disconnect between the time frame of the idea being developed or incubated to actually moving it forward
Hmm.
through that process. So again, red light, green light, develop the IP strategy, red light, green light, develop the next piece, red light, green light, and just keep working it through. And as long as it's being green lit, it's being, turned over and turned over. And then the other piece of this is around equity. And this is where it gets, a bit interesting, because the difference between an entrepreneur and an innovator is an entrepreneur wants to maintain control, and that's maintained through a legal structure of equity, whereas a founder or an innovator would want to give that up and retain a certain portion of it, so that they have some personal monetary success because of their thoughts. And I think that's a fair exchange of value. So in this model, the innovator would actually be giving up more equity. And so if somebody said, we really like what you're doing, but we're not willing to give up the equity for whatever reason, we'd say, well, that is an indicator for us that you should actually go to an incubator, accelerator, or venture studio, because that's what they're there to do. So we're not trying to replace them. We're offering that other solution, which is saying, you know, if you actually want this commercialized where you can just be the product owner, the CTO, here's how we would go about it. if you're in agreement with that, we can move that forward. And then if it was publicly traded, this is where it gets interesting. We could actually give them public shares on day one that they could actually turn into cash. So they're not waiting that 10, 15-year exit. And one of the other pieces, again, just kind of on the peripheral, I continually hear people talk about creating more head offices. And I see, publicly funded venture capital, especially where I live in Canada, supporting companies up to, Series B, say, and then they're being bought by foreign interest, and the ownership and the head office disappears. And then, all the elected officials can't figure out what just happened, had the rug get pulled out from under them, considering they're the ones that actually funded, that exit. And I think, again, if you want more domestic head offices and ownership, publicly funded venture capital, again, is an oxymoron. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And so private equity negates the need for venture capital. It can move way upstream in technology readiness levels to pull, or, innovation that matters through the commercialization process using a venture builder quicker.
So there's a million questions, like idea versus execution. And I think that dichotomy, or how you think about that, would be fun. But if we switch just for a second to I'm a retail investor, I buy it, I'm an early adopter, I find it super interesting, I want exposure to some of these things. How would I value that? Like, there's no stream, at least for years and years and years. Like, are you just betting on the pickers of the companies? Like, just how should I think about that?
Yeah, and again, there's so much complexity around the public market, not only just retail investor valuing it. And we also have to remember that, stock promotion is real, other than blue chip, I mean, it
Yeah.
frothy is frothy, as they say, right? So how do we mitigate for those issues? Because what we're really trying to do is create a long-term wealth preservation, safe institutional stock that people can invest in as that part of their portfolio. And that's why I say we still need to put some rigor to this thinking, because I think that's where we've got to kind of work through a whole bunch of those scenarios, and not, like, actually, realistically, like stock promotion is a really good example. That how do we prevent a lot of these things from happening? And part of that is government support. There's a great article in Harvard Business Review called Tri-Sector Leadership, and it was actually the chairman of McKinsey that actually introduced me to this idea. And so I think there's some role for public security and scrutiny in this private equity model. It's not just private equity as we know private equity to be today. And the other piece of that, regarding public input and interest, and why it's important to kind of have this nonprofit, for-profit, government tri-sector intersection, is that ideally these organizations that we're suggesting having access to the academic grant process would be really useful. So every grant application that's going through these foundations and public institutions, knowing what people are actually thinking about and doing early on, before they're even thinking about patents, would also be really useful. So it's kind of two birds with one stone. But yeah, so there's lots of challenges around that. But I think if you stay focused on long-term wealth preservation, safe, but within a group of innovation, how do you get from 0 to 1? Because once we're at 2, we'll have a whole bunch of revenue producing companies that we own the majority share of.
Right.
It'll be a non-issue. So it's
sure.
what is the philanthropic or government piece that's going to get us from zero to two,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It
And
strikes me also. Sorry, please go
well, I was just going to say part of that is just the number, so you know would you start as a private equity non-publicly traded share? Probably.
ahead.
Would you want public government support? Only if it comes with access to um, technology transfer information and probably $200 million just to start,
Yeah.
if not a billion. So there's kind of those no go
Yeah.
things to think about, because otherwise, we're just falling back to, entrepreneurship and venture studios. That is the current right model
Yeah.
uh, to deal with these quasi, entrepreneurial, not quite founders, right?
Yeah. It strikes me also as like a very interesting marketing problem in a way, right? I was like on the endowment side for a number of years, and a big part of it is filling buckets, right? Do we have this bucket filled with this exposure and this risk level and this and that? And there's a good book called Play Bigger, which is all about like creating category kings, right? So when you think of ride sharing, you think Uber. When you think of X, you think whatever. And if you could become the Blackstone of this, like, okay, money flows to you. And like, that's a very nice position to be in. Um, and Peter, we're running up on time. So I want to make sure like we end where are your priorities right now? How can we support you? What are you looking to do? Are you looking for thought partners? Are you looking for investors? Are you looking like, how could we possibly help in any small way?
Yeah, and I think we'll use buckets as the analogy. There's the private equity bucket that needs a lot of thought put into it. And I was thinking about, like, what does that consortium look like? How does it start? I can't think through that on my own. What are all the challenges? And again, I had some really interesting advice from a colleague around market manipulation, and I thought, yeah, that's actually really serious. We have to actually model that and think through that before we get into the implementation. So I think the expertise and thinking is important, and then the other piece is really designing the de-risked, improved trust. What is the messaging and what is the public relations strategy to get this open source idea into the thinking of family offices, foundations, endowments, public sector, elected officials, people that actually are concerned about their economy. How do we make this a priority for them? What's that messaging? And just having more conversations. And really, for me, it's a hypothesis. It's open source. What I'm really asking for is to have it challenged. Like, I've convinced myself, I've drank my own Kool-Aid based on my experience, that private equity along with venture capital is going to produce a better result, and venture builders along with venture studios and incubators and accelerators is going to produce a better result. Like anybody making a movie, let's do all the work pre-production, and
Yeah.
I have my own red and green light, like, fail me out so I don't
Yeah.
waste my life thinking about this, or let's move it forward and let's actually accelerate it moving forward if people agree it's actually a worthy idea.
Yeah.
But I do believe, a lot of people ask me, why don't you just do this privately? Why don't you just start a fund? I do believe that if we actually are concerned with overcoming wicked problems around equality and inequality, then I think it does need to have a public-private, nonprofit intersection to really move the needle. And that is my ultimate goal. Isn't just to create, another, copy of Y Combinator, but actually to create something that actually creates a lot of value. And this is a systemic issue worldwide. So the US and China are the last places that require this, but every other country in the world would absolutely flourish introducing an idea like this into their economy.
Hmm. Peter, it's fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to share more. couple friends come to mind that I think would be fun to riff with, and they will push back hard on some of those assumptions and questions. So I think that could be a fun next
we
step.
can record the next conversation with some naysayers.
Amazing, amazing. I look forward to
Love the
that.
devil's advocate.
Yes, they're thoughtfully,
Yeah,
they're thoughtful devils. Maybe that's the best.
that is what I'm looking for. Yeah,
Amazing.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. It's been
Yeah.
a real. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about this and get some other input.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thanks for sharing more, Peter. This was great.
Okay.
All right, talk soon.